Well, up next on CBC, her work has helped solve cold cases worldwide. She has helped convict serial killers and identify victims without a name. She does it through DNA and DNA databases. Cece Moore is the chief genetic genealogist from Parabon Nanolabs in the United States. And she says she has some confidence that the type of work that she does and the technology she works with could help identify Buffalo woman's identity here in Winnipeg if asked. And of course, a warning on our story. It's part of the ongoing series of stories about the deaths of 4 women from our community. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us first what you do as a genetic genealogist? Like, what does that mean?
Sure. Genetic genealogy is when you use DNA to learn more about a person's family history, their genealogy, and genetic heritage. And so it can be used to learn about your long dead, distant ancestors. It can be used to help adoptees and donor conceived individuals to identify their biological families and build that genetic family tree. And it can be used to identify violent criminals and also unidentified Jane and John Doe cases.
Can you walk us through the process of it? Like, what do you need to make that identification happen?
So we have to go back to the original biological material, that DNA from a crime scene or from unidentified human remains. And the reason we have to do that is we're using a more advanced technology than what has been used in the past. So prior to the last few years, law enforcement was just using a handful of genetic markers called STRs. And what we're doing is we're looking at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome. And it's a different type of genetic marker. It's called a SNP. And so we have to have that DNA, send it to one of these advanced labs, which, by the way, I don't think there's any in Canada yet that are capable of this. So that evidence will always come to a private lab in the United States until the crime labs start gearing up with this type of equipment in their own labs, which I really do hope happens. But at the moment, it needs to be sent to a lab in the United States and then analyzed. Once we have that analysis done, there's often a lot of work that has to be done that's called bioinformatics. So when you're dealing with unidentified human remains or any type of DNA sample that is non-optimal, you have to repair the degradation. And you often have to extract out the bacterial contamination. So if there have been remains or DNA that has been stored for a long time or been out in the environment, it's very common that it has bacterial contamination. And that bacteria inserts its DNA into the human DNA. So you have to have scientists that are experts at extracting that out and then repairing that DNA. Once that step is done, it can be uploaded to 2 databases that are working with law enforcement that are called GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. There's a huge misconception that we're using Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. Unfortunately, we're not. Those are the largest databases. There's over 40 million people that have tested in those databases, but we are limited to these 2 smallest databases. Once the DNA file is in there of that unknown individual, then it is compared against the people in these databases that have opted into law enforcement matching, and we get a list of people that share amounts of DNA with that unknown person. So it could be a close relative, but most of the time we're going to work with very distant relatives.
Is the part that is new in terms of the technology, when you think about how DNA analysis would have been used in the past in cold cases or otherwise to help law enforcement, that separation, as you said, of the contamination, is that something that wouldn't have been possible before?
Well, they've been doing that for a long time for law enforcement analysis, but it's certainly grown leaps and bounds recently. So that is part of what's different. But the main thing that is different is we're looking at a different type of genetic marker, a different type of DNA, and we're looking at much more of it. So when you're doing a one-to-one comparison, when you know who this is, or you think you know who it is, then you can compare against that individual, if they're alive, or a very close family member. You would traditionally need a first-degree relative, which is a parent or child. But with what we're doing, we're using such a broad swath of the genome that we can use second, third, fourth cousins and beyond to reverse engineer someone's identity from past people sharing DNA with them. And so it really just stretches out much further in that family tree, trying to find people that are related.
So it's not so much about either what the DNA might be on, for sake of a better way to put that. So if you ask what would Winnipeg police need to provide someone with, or you with, for example, to help you identify a potential suspect or victim, and to be clear, in this particular case, DNA, they said, helped in their investigation, but they will not go into specifics. But what you're saying is it's not so much if it's a hair works better than a piece of clothing, for example. It's not about that anyway.
It used to be that you could not use hair unless it had a root. But recently there's been great advances where you can use that rootless hair, that hair shaft, to still discover who these individuals are. So obviously I don't have inside information. I don't know what they have, but if they had blood, that would be optimal. But even if it's not blood, if it's saliva, if it's urine, if it's hair, all of those things could be analyzed in order to create this profile that we need, this profile of this unknown individual, compare it against those in these databases. And then little by little, you piece that family tree back together from that. And because we all have unique family trees, and except for our full siblings, then you can usually narrow it down to just one family. And if someone is missing, it becomes pretty obvious once you get there.
Now, you were involved actually in a case that was related to Canada, a cold case, a double homicide of a BC couple, if I'm remembering this correctly. The victims were traveling to Seattle by van. They were killed in 1987. So this technology, the genetic genealogy, factored in to an arrest in that case, I understand. Now, would that be because, though, the database was on the U.S. side of the border?
Well, the perpetrator in that case, yes, was from the US, and he had deep roots in the United States. And so our databases are primarily made up of people that have Northwest European ancestry. So it's much easier to identify someone from that population group. And most of the people in the database have roots in the United States, but Canada is probably the second most represented in these databases. What makes it more difficult when you're trying to identify a Canadian is that your privacy laws are so much stricter than ours. So your DNA means nothing to me if I can't figure out how to build your family tree. Who are you? Who are your parents and grandparents? And then I have to do what's called reverse genealogy or descendancy research. Once I identify those common ancestors, I have to find their descendants. Well, in the US, that's very doable. But in Canada, from my experience, it's much more difficult. I've worked on lots of Canadian cases. Law enforcement up there keeps it much quieter, but it takes much more collaboration with the detectives and the agencies, because we as private individuals can't access public information in Canada to help us identify these people unless they have really strong social media through that family, or there's really good obituaries out there, or they have put their public family tree on the internet or on one of these genealogy websites. But very often we're struggling to identify who are the parents of this person, who are their grandparents, and then, as I said, the opposite way, who are the descendants of, say, this great-great-grandparent couple. And so it is more challenging to do it up there, one, because the lower representation in the databases, and two, because of the difficulty of identifying living people or recently living people.
What are some of the other drawbacks of the process?
Well, it really depends on who's in that database. Because we're limited to these two smallest databases, we just don't have everybody's close relatives in there. So most of the time we're working with very distant relatives. Every population group is different as far as representation, but also as far as considerations. So if you're working with, say, American Indian or Native populations, one, we don't have the representation that we would like in the databases. And two, the records aren't always as easy to access for us. So typically when you get further back in the tree, even in Canada, you can access those records, but those records have to exist. Also, if you're trying to identify someone who is an immigrant or recent immigrant to North America, you might have to work in records in a different language. They, again, might not exist. It might be much more difficult. So we have a lot of cases in the United States that have recent Latin American ancestry. that means someone has to know the language. They have to be able to read Spanish and work in those records. They have to know where to find those record sets. And so there's a lot of different considerations with what we do. And until you get that DNA and get it in the database, we don't know what those challenges will be for each case.
What are some of your biggest successes?
I would say, I've helped to identify hundreds of violent criminals all across the United States and even in Canada as well. But I have one case where doing that helped someone to be formally exonerated for a rape and murder that he had been convicted of. And so, it's never a happy celebratory thing when you identify a murderer rapist. That is one time where there was pure joy, because there is absolutely nothing negative about helping an innocent man go free and clear his name after 20 years. So that was the Angie Dodge case out of Idaho Falls, Idaho. And it was just an amazing thing to be part of. I'm incredibly fortunate that my hobby and then my avocation turned into work that I'm so passionate about, and I can really make a difference for people.
Have you had success identifying, people that are unidentified as well, or mostly with perpetrators?
Yes. Yeah, all across the country, we've been able to help identify Jane and John Does. In fact, we have a long-term contract with the state of Oregon, and we are helping them to identify their unidentified human remains that are in their medical examiner's office. It's with the Oregon State Police. They have about 100 sets of human remains. And we have been able to work on 39 of those so far with 30 positive identifications. And so we really love bringing answers to these families that have been waiting. It's always a sad thing, but the families are so thankful to be able to get those answers and get that resolution about what happened to their loved one. Those are oftentimes my favorite cases. It's strange to say favorite, but I really do enjoy those types of cases, because my work has always been about providing answers and resolution to family about their loved ones, whether it was for adoptees, donor conceived, or these types of cases.
It's exactly what I was going to ask you, how it feels, knowing that you can help give peace to a family. Must be incredible.
Sounds kind of silly, but I always wanted to be able to help to make an impact somehow. And it took me till my 40s that I found created this very meaningful career. And it means so much to me to be able to help these families and make a difference and make society a safer place as well.
When you think about the case of Buffalo woman here in Winnipeg, how might your work help to identify her? Like with what you've read, is it a fit for the type of thing we're talking about potentially, I guess?
Well, because I don't know exactly what they have, it's hard to address that. But if they have even the smallest amount of DNA from her, we absolutely can help identify her through investigative genetic genealogy. And so if they're struggling to determine who she is, possibly she hasn't been reported missing, which we see in the vast majority of the cases we work on, this will help to identify that immediate family or even that extended family she's from, and then they can go out and start talking to those individuals and determine who's missing from among them.
Cece Moore, thank you very much for the conversation today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. I could talk about this all day.
Take care.
Thank you so much.